Hi everyone. So for this week, we're going to be discussing the second part of Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding. Um, and really, rather than sort of move systematically through the book, I'm sort of dealing more with how Hume approaches certain topics. And my general idea is that the hope is that by doing that, we can start to get a sense of like his overall philosophical method, and then that will allow us to better understand each of the individual components of Hume's inquiry. I think I mentioned, in the last video that a lot of people think of this as being like one of the best sort of like epistemology treatise that have ever been written, right? So it's well worth definitely paying attention to some of the details. And so part of what's going to be involved in this video is really fleshing out in a lot more detail what was approached towards the end of the last video, which is Hume's account of causation, right? We primarily, for the last time, we sort of talked about the nature of the problem, right? We talked about the possibilities for a rational justification for causal judgments, right? And we concluded at that point that that was not available according to Hume, that we could never arrive at a non-circular explanation for our inference to causal explanations, right? At least that's my own understanding of the material. And so we then left off by saying, like, okay, well, Hume's account then is that causality is a certain kind of habit, right? But we didn't really fill in what exactly we meant by habit in that way. So this class is sort of, in some ways, going to be a way of fleshing out Hume's approach to the causality question, specifically sort of like focusing on that chapter that's sort of like the skeptical solution to what he sees as the problem of induction. This was brought up by some of the class members that, one way of sort of referring to Hume's fork is to call it the problem of induction, right? And in general, we sort of arrive at this perspective by realizing that relations of ideas are deductive arguments. Deductive means that the conclusion must necessarily follow from the premises, right? If the premises are true and the argument is valid, then the conclusion must be true, right? Good example of this sort of reasoning is like mathematical reasoning, right? When you say 2 plus 2 equals 4, you don't say like, it's probably 4, right? Or something like that. Whereas with like experimental observations, you have to say that, right? Because you're always in the process of sort of revising your own knowledge, right? So deductive arguments, we sort of understand how those work, right? We understand the central governing principle of these, which is the principle of non-contradiction, right? If 2 plus 2 didn't equal 4, then there would be a fundamental contradiction in our mathematical concepts. That's the sort of idea. This idea is also present in Leibniz. And I think that this is sort of like more akin to the contemporary notion of arithmetic. And we'll see sort of a different point of view whenever we analyze Kant, which is going to be for the next few weeks. So that's all to say, like, okay, one reason why you might call Hume's fork the problem of induction is because we know the principle guiding deductive inferences. It's the principle of non-contradiction, right? And here we can see so much overlap with Leibniz because in primary truths, Leibniz referred to the principle of non-contradiction as sort of the principle for analytic judgments, right? And so Hume's question is about um, synthetic judgments, or you might also say is about the principle of induction. So, like, what is it that allows us to say, because in previous instances I've observed this, then I can make the inference that in the future that they will continue to resemble that, right? Um, one example is the sun rising, right? Every time I've woken up, the sun has risen, right? And then I infer from that that the sun will rise in the future. But of course, that is an inference, right? Because I could also decide, that inference is not correct, right? I could predict that, the universe, for whatever reason, is going to explode, or, the sun is going to supernova or something. And so it's not going to rise tomorrow. So, the point being, it's not impossible, right, for that event to occur, right? So, what sort of evidence is really given to us by the fact that previous instances, have confirmed this as a trend? What is the basis for the inference that this is going to continue into the future, right? And you can kind of see how this is a big problem for scientific experimentation, right? And thinking about like what is going on whenever you're conducting experiments, like what is sort of the licensing the inference to future cases, right? These are fundamentally Humean problems. And I think that this is why Hume is taken very, very seriously. In this respect, this problem in early modern philosophy is often considered one of the most intractable, but also important. Intractable because it seems difficult to provide really an account of that principle of inductive reasoning. Okay, so that's just to say, here's why you might call that the problem of induction, right? Here's how it relates to previous authors we've talked about, especially Leibniz in Primary Truths. And here's why there's a problem for induction, but there's not a corresponding problem with deduction, right? We do have a principle for analytic judgments. We have a principle for how to resolve questions about relations of ideas. And that principle is the law of non-contradiction. The question is, what is the principle for synthetic judgments or judgments regarding matters of fact, right? How do I reach conclusions regarding those, right, in a principled way? And that's really what these sort of questions are going to be about, right? Okay, so let's get started on some things written on the whiteboard here. So these three categories, hopefully you will recall from last week, are ways that we relate ideas, or ways that we sort of connect our representations, right? Those are, for our purposes, the same thing. And part of understanding the problem that we're dealing with, the problem of induction or the problem of causality or Hume's fork, however you would like to put it, is that we have to acknowledge that there's a special kind of status, a special kind of problem that's associated with cause and effect that's not associated with mere resemblance and contiguity, right? And this difference that I've written here is that the first two categories, resemblance and contiguity, these have merely subjective purport, right? So to purport something is like to claim, right? And so in this case, to say that it has merely subjective purport is to say that these relations of ideas we're not claiming are the way that the world actually is. It's just the way that the world shows up to me, right? Okay, and so like, in that respect, we can give some examples, right? In terms of resemblance, right? there's widespread disagreement, right? So, like, I might claim that the Impossible Whopper really resembles the actual Whopper, right? The beef Whopper or whatever. Whereas someone else that is perhaps more enamored with the beef variant would like to insist on a difference, that they actually don't resemble each other. Um, and so, what's going on in these cases of disagreement? Well, it's merely subjective. And so, the way that we're linking it is we're attaching a property to them. And we're saying that they resemble one another in virtue of some property, right? So, to continue with our example, in the case of the Impossible Whopper and the Beef Whopper, right, maybe the comparison that I'm making is I'm trying to say that they're similar in terms of, like, I don't know, juiciness or something like that, right? Whereas the person who wants to insist on the importance of the beef whopper, right, would then say, oh, well, they don't resemble each other at all in terms of their texture or something like that, right? You can take any property you want. But the point is that whether or not things resemble each other is just whether we associate them as having a common property, right? That is what makes them resemble one another. That's the sense in which, a picture of a thing resembles the actual thing. Is it, when you ask that question, you're asking about how many properties do they have in common, right? Okay, so contiguity, right? This is just spatial and temporal juxtaposition, right? Things are right next to each other, right? And for things to be right next to each other, that's different from resemblance because they don't need to share any sort of quality, right? Or sort of property, right? And so in this case, the link is also just a mere spatial and temporal juxtaposition, right? And if you want an example of how this is merely subjective, right, you might say that, like, for me, I associate a certain period of my life with the release of certain video games, like Pokemon Red and Blue, right? And so I think of that period as being contiguous with a certain period of my life, right? But obviously that's merely subjective, right? It's not as if, like, I don't know, everyone associates being 8 years old with that specific video game or whatever, right? People associate it with their own sort of experiences, right? And so that's why contiguity of our representations has merely subjective purports, right? It's not about what the world is like, it's about what the world was like for me, right? Okay, and so then why is there a special problem with cause and effect, right? The reason why cause and effect are different is that they have a kind of objective purport, right? So, like, whenever I say fire causes smoke, right, I'm not just saying that for me, every time I've seen fire, there has been smoke or something like that. I'm saying, no, continuing into the future, it will continue to be that way, right? And so, just in the same way that in the previous sort of relations of ideas, we had to have some sort of principle, right, for how they linked, right? In this one, the link was a property. In this one, the link was spatial temporal juxtaposition, right? So the question is, what sort of link does a cause and an effect have, right? What is the nature of their relationship? When we say that fire causes smoke, right, what are we talking about as being sort of the binding relationship with them? Why is it that when there is fire, there must be smoke, right? And this must part is very important, right? And so it has objective purport because I'm claiming that that's what the universe is actually like. But then, in order to justify that sort of claim, I have to do it on some sort of basis, right? We have to be able to at least potentially resolve disagreements because the world is only one way, right? And so the question of causality is essentially a question about what kind of linkage there is between a cause and its effect, right? And so I've written here, it's kind of small, so it might be difficult to see. I've written here a little preview. Kant, the next philosopher that we're going to be discussing, essentially takes this as the question, how is metaphysics possible, right? How do we make judgments about the way that the world really is, right? What is the basis, what is the principle guiding those sort of judgments, right? And that's how Kant is going to take up this sort of problem, and he's going to really generalize it. He's going to really try to explain that what Hume sees as a really narrow problem related to cause and effect, Kant takes to be an absolutely fundamental problem that's related to the very possibility of doing metaphysics, right? Of studying the ultimate nature of reality. Okay. So part of what we're going to try to show now is we're going to try to explain exactly what Hume's account of causality is, right? And then how he thinks that we fall under this illusion that metaphysics sort of provokes in us, right? Like one thing you might have thought after the result of last class period is you might think like, well, why do we fall into the illusion of metaphysics in the first place, right? If we just have this habit, as Hume is saying, of making causal judgments, like, why do we sort of like fall into deceiving ourselves in the first place, right? And so we're going to try to clarify that what Hume means by habit is constant conjunction, right? Okay. So the example I've given here, fire, smoke, fire, smoke, fire, smoke, etc., right? And so the Hume's empiricist idea is we have a sensation of the cause, we have a sensation of the effect, right? But what we do not have a sensation of is the causal force, the thing that makes it necessary for the cause to relate to the effect, right? And this necessity is the basis of the objective purport of these kind of judgments, right? Okay. So Hume says that from the constancy of the relationship, we infer a force that we take to be the basis of the synthetic connection, right? So like when the fire causes smoke all the time, right? I attribute a certain kind of property, right, to the fire, which is sort of like causal force, like this fire is capable of producing smoke, right? Now for Hume, when Hume says that causality is mere habit or constant conjunction, what he is denying, in my opinion, is that we have any insight at all into the nature of this causal force, right? We do not have any sort of relationship, right, to that. That's not something that we can sense. And because it's not something that we can sense, it's not something that we can think, right? And so Hume's skeptical solution is to deny that we have access to anything like causal forces, right? And instead say that all we perceive are the conjuncts, right? I see fire and smoke. But, another way of putting this is I don't see the conditional, right? I don't see the necessity. I don't see the metaphysical part. I don't see the necessary link between the two. I just happen to see one and I happen to see the other, right? And then whether or not I decide to make it a causal judgment is merely a function of how constantly I have seen those things conjoined, right? And so, we have very firm beliefs about the sun setting, tonight and, going up tomorrow, right? Because we've seen that every day of our lives, right? But other things we have less certain causal judgments about, and maybe they don't even exceed to the level of a causal judgment. Okay, so the trap of metaphysics, right, is, I've tried to draw it here. Instead of drawing the images, I've just written a C and an E for cause and effect, and an F to indicate the underlying force, right? So in this case, the sort of first series, right, the red is our sensations, right? We perceive a cause, we perceive the effect. We see fire, we see smoke, right? And then this lower level that I've written in blue, the F's, right? These kind of form this underlying metaphysical reality, right? That we do not directly sense, right? But which governs the necessary relationships between the things that we do see, right? And so, in a way, Hume is trying to explain the whole basis of the kind of rationalist program. Like, why do you think that there's some underlying metaphysical reality to the world? Well, it's because you don't actually see or perceive necessary relations, right? You have to infer necessary relations from the things that you do see. And so this is why the rationalist metaphysicians exist in a kind of inverted world, right? Where God, the thing that we don't see and have no access to, right, is sort of the most fundamental and most true reality, whereas everything that we have access to, the entire physical world, anything that we can sense, touch, or experience, right, then becomes mere appearances, right? They are not fundamental. And, I think a really good example of someone who Hume is criticizing is Leibniz, right? Because Leibniz will say, hey, the phenomenal reality of bodies, that's mere appearances, right? But the underlying noumenal relationship is the metaphysical relationship, the one between monads, right? Okay, and so I've written here, here the underlying stability of the world is excised to a weird metaphysical plane that we do not know, that is meant to explain what we do know, right? And you can see this especially in the rationalist accounts of substance, right? For the rationalists, right, I think especially Descartes and Spinoza, right, God is sort of the source in some ways of all of the particular things that we see, and it's the most fundamental reality that we have, right? And so, in some ways, what Hume is accusing the rationalists, I think especially Descartes and Spinoza, is trying to explain all the stuff that we do know and we do have access to in the real world by basis through some weird metaphysical world that's supposed to be a source of explanation, right? But there's no way that we could ever know that, right? We don't have access to another underlying world, right? And so part of what Hume is trying to say is that the whole impetus to start doing metaphysics, right? The whole reason why, all of these figures start talking about substance is because they want to know about the relationship between what they see as the substance, which is the underlying reality designated Hume here by force, right? They want to understand the relationship between substance and its modifications, right? Or its properties. And this emerges basically from, Hume says, a sort of animalistic instinct that we have to make this kind of inference, right? That we try to perceive between the lines the fundamental structure of the universe in some way. But we're doomed in that way because there's no way that we could ever get knowledge for doing that, because there's no way that we could ever sense what that's like, right? And so this is part of Hume's very harsh judgment about the whole kind of substance language that we've been using up to this point, and that was so important for many of the other thinkers that we've discussed. Okay, really briefly, I want to move over to this column. So, one thing that can be kind of confusing about Hume's treatment is that it seems like he begins on a really weird discussion about human freedom that doesn't seem to have anything to do with the previous stuff about causality, right? Maybe in some weird way, talking about human freedom is like talking about how we cause things in the world, right? That kind of makes sense. But the specific connection that Hume's making can be hard to understand. And this is because it happens in Locke. Specifically, it happens in a section of the essay concerning human understanding that we didn't really have the time to be able to treat, right? Locke, we sort of have described Locke in this class as the most lax empiricist, in the sense that he's willing to take on the most concepts from the rationalists, right? And substance and force are some of these concepts that Locke says is basically okay, right? And so you might ask, well, based on the analysis that we just saw before, right, we could never have sort of an empiricist account of force, right? So what does Locke's look like, and why is it insufficient for Hume, right? Well, Locke thought that we could understand causal force, right, because we can reflect on our own voluntary actions, right? I go out into the world, I make stuff happen, right? I can lift up this tissue box, I can put it down, right? And so Locke then says, okay, well, what do we infer from that? Well, Penelope has the causal power to lift up, a tissue box, right? And to put it down. And the reason why it's a causal force is because it's not always actualized, right? I always have the possibility of lifting up the tissue box, but I don't always actually do it, right? But for Hume, this is a classic example of metaphysical reasoning using abstract concepts, right? Why is this abstract? Well, because we're trying to sort of take something that we do have experiences of, which is engaging in particular kinds of actions, right? And then we sort of make that an abstraction, right? That's supposed to be oh, that's causal force, right? And so then we start attributing all of these properties to stuff, right? Penelope has the property of having the causal force of lifting up the tissue box, right? She also has the causal force of lifting up the marker, right? She has the causal force of lifting up the pen, right? And so you start to have to attribute to all these agents a whole like gamut of these weird properties, right? Um, and so what Hume says is that, well, what happened is we engaged in a case of abstract reasoning, as was criticized by Berkeley, right? We're making the same mistake essentially as the rationalists did, right? We're trying to infer from our experience something way beyond our experience could ever possibly attest to by means of some weird kind of loose analogy, right? Um, and so, part of Hume's account then is to say that, hey, even other empiricists have fallen into this sort of problem. Okay, last couple of things that we're going to discuss. I want to discuss Hume on animal cognition and to discuss Hume about miracles, right? Why does Hume have a chapter about animals in this book? Well, because Hume is trying to say that our propensity to make an inference beyond the things that we see the into the metaphysical basis of the world, Hume says is basically present in animals, right? The animals too make causal judgments, and you can bring up sort of Pavlovian kinds of examples, right? Animals make causal inferences, right? And then Hume says, well, of course animals don't have reason, right? And because animals don't have reason, then we must know then that the inference that we're making is not a rational inference, right? Okay, so that's why you write a chapter on animal cognition. I wanted to bring that up because this was another aspect of my very productive back and forth with Mike last week. Okay, and then Mike also brought up the chapter on miracles, right? It kind of seems like there's a tension in some ways, right? Because Hume is so skeptical on the one hand, right? But he also says that miracles are impossible in principle, right? That we can know for certain that miracles are not true, right? Okay, so what's Hume's argument to that effect? He gives a lot of reasons for why we shouldn't believe in miracles from a psychological standpoint. He's like, okay, well, you really get knowledge of things through sensation, right? And it's because you get knowledge of things through sensation that you typically don't actually experience yourself a miracle, right? Normally it comes from testimony, right? It comes from other people. And so, that already sort of lowers the epistemic status of what you've heard, right? Because they could be lying to you, they could be embellishing, right? All of this kind of stuff, right? And then it's even worse because usually it's like generational, right? It's like kind of a story that's been handed down over and over, right? About this thing that happened. And miracles are defined by being at odds with the course of nature, right? And so, in my view, Hume is almost giving like a quasi mathematical argument for why you should never believe in miracles, right? You should never believe in miracles because the totality of your experience is of natural relationships, right? Hume is already assuming from the outset that you yourself have not experienced a miracle in the precise sense of a miracle, right? Because miracles are defined by going outside of the course of nature, right? And then what he has in mind here, perhaps paradigmatically, is like the resurrection, right? Resurrection is not something that happens in the natural course of nature, right? And then Hume says, okay, and then, human beings, like, we really want to believe in things like this, right? It's very astounding. It can also, like, give you a lot of social capital to be the sort of person that knows about them, right? So these are even more reasons to start to doubt it, right? And so essentially what Hume is saying is that you have to give up on 100% of your own experiences, right? That you've experienced directly because they've all been in the natural course of nature, right? For an extremely meager chance, I don't know, we'll just say 1%, that the person that you're talking to is not lying or embellishing or it hasn't, shifted as a result of generational change, right? All of this evidence that you can only have in an extraordinarily indirect way, right? You have to sacrifice all of your actual experiences, right? Everything, your whole life, right? The whole totality of everything that you've experienced up to this point would have to be in some way false for the miracle to be true, right? And so this is why Hume says, even though he's so skeptical about our ability to know the future, he says nonetheless, you can know for certain, right, that in the future there are not going to be miracles, right? Just because of what such a shift in your judgments would imply, right? It would imply that you would give up on the direct evidence that you actually experience for the indirect evidence that comes from testimonial knowledge, etc. Right? And so this is why that could never be rational for Hume, because the only way that we have rational knowledge is through our own sensation, right? So I don't see his account of miracles really as being in tension with his account of induction, right? He claims that we can basically be certain that there will never be miracles, right? But really that stems from the nature of miracles, right? That miracles are sort of like this chimerical kind of concept that could never really show up in experience anyway, right? And so that's how we can know that there will never be miracles, not because we have some really robust scientific knowledge or something like that, right? But because miracles sort of go against the very structure of how we gain knowledge and experience. Okay. Finally, I want to end with the last couple of sentences of the enquiry because they are a real banger. They're great, right? Hume asks, he's imagining that you're given a manuscript, right? And you're asking, what should you do with it, right? And he says, okay. He asks, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number, right? So, is it about the relation of our ideas? Is it about mathematics and arithmetic, right? No, right? Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matters of fact or existence, right? So, is it scientific? Is it mathematical or is it scientific, right? And Hume imagines his interlocutor as saying no, right? And so then Hume says, commit it then to flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion, right? And you can see very clearly how this encapsulates the whole argument of the book, right? The only two sources of knowledge we have are relations of ideas, right? Which concern quantity or number, right? So that's one source of knowledge, right? So if it doesn't have that, right, then turn to our other source of knowledge, right? Our knowledge concerning matters of fact, right? Experimentation, sensation, and so on, right? Does it have any of that? No, right? And so what should you do with it? Commit it then to the flames. Throw it away, right? It's not going to do any good for you. There's no way that it could possibly produce knowledge because it doesn't actually concern either of the sources of our knowledge, right? And so that's how Hume ends the book. Arguing basically that we should throw away everything that we've read up to this point in the semester should just be burned, right? Amazing, so witty, right? Love it. It's great. Okay, well, I think that's enough to finish off Hume. Next few videos, we're going to be talking about Kant. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope you're having a great day. Bye.